All right, so if you have questions about your book review or you want to send a copy of your book review to me so I can look it over, do that sometime next week. They're due on the 30th, which is Monday. Not this Monday, but the Monday after, because today is the 19th. So if you send me a copy of your book review, I'll tell you if you're kind of on track and give you some general ideas. You can also send some general questions if you want. There's a format online in the assignment section. Make sure you do what it asks you to do in the format, 3 separate sections. One really about the book, one about the thesis, and then one about your opinion, which includes what you recommended, how does it compare to stuff you already know, how does it compare to stuff in the book about that subject or that era, and make sure that the book you're reading, unless I gave you some thumbs up otherwise, is from that time period, the time period after the Civil War, which there was somebody that sent me a list of books they wanted to read, and one of them was a Revolutionary Era book, and that's too early. Uh-oh. I hit something, sorry. That was a weird noise, wasn't it? Okay, or maybe you didn't hear it. Okay, so let me think if there's other stuff that I need to tell you. I don't really think there is. I've had people ask me how they are supposed to know when things are due. I'm going to always refer you to the thesis, excuse me, the syllabus. I don't know why I was thinking about my thesis, which I haven't thought about in years. So the syllabus tells you when everything's due, tells you exactly what the assignments are and what, when you need to turn them in. It also tells you what days we have class and what days we don't. Pretty sure of that. We are not scheduled to have class next week. If that is a problem for any of you, you could send me an email and say like, no, I really want to have class on Tuesday, and I would have a Zoom meeting with you and we could talk about whatever you want to talk about. So I don't have class scheduled next week. Somebody asked if we would have class on Thursday. It's like, don't you have something to do on Thursday? So hopefully you got something to do. But yeah, no class next week. And that's really just so you can work on the book review, get caught up in other stuff. And maybe I'll get caught up on grading. We will see. Hopefully that'll work. I was more busy than I thought I would be yesterday, but tomorrow I'm off, and Saturday I don't have anything to do. And Sunday it's kind of back to business, I guess. So hopefully I'll get caught up, and hopefully you'll get caught up. And again, if you have any questions about anything, send an email. And again, we don't have class planned for next week. Also, if you are iPhone 2, don't forget to type your name in so I can count you present, okay? And you might, oh, you already did, I'm sorry. You were in process. I was just impatient, wasn't I? All right. I've been told I'm like that. I thought I was just fine, but apparently not always true. All right, so let's talk about the stuff. You ready? All right. Oh, one of my Zoom meetings is recording. Here we go. Lecture notes twice. Sorry, weekly question. Okay, let's look at the weekly question really quick. You noticed already that I've suggested that you turn these things in on certain days. Question 1, I suggested by next Friday, but again, that's just suggested. It is not due until December 11th. And question 1's the one we'll start to talk about a little bit today, maybe finish. Analyze the success of Reagan's administration in both domestic and foreign policy. So domestic is stuff at home. Foreign policy is stuff overseas, and explain why he left office popular with the public despite leaving an enormous national debt, which I know is probably a debt we would trade now if we could have one in the billions rather than the trillions. But I think people don't worry about national debt the way that we did back then. I'm certain they don't. But, at some point, it might be good to pay that thing off. And the other two questions, if you could turn in, you know, one a week, that would be great. If you can't, that's also legitimate. So, you know, no pressure, just saying things might, you know, be easier for both of us if you could turn them in earlier. All right, now we'll go to the notes. And, you know, as always, if you have a question, just shout it out or turn on your mic or type it in. Okay. All right. So we are talking about Reagan today. Actually, we're going back to Watergate, which is not Reagan. And then we'll talk about Watergate, Ford, Carter, and Reagan. Okay. All right. And I still haven't made your review thing, but if I don't get it done today, which I don't think I will, because I have 3 classes and then I have 2 meetings tonight. I'm super excited about both. But then tomorrow I have nothing scheduled. My goodness, I can't think of the last day I've had nothing scheduled. So I should be able to get caught up on work. 2 meetings. Plus I'm supposed to watch one online. Ugh, ugh. So many meetings. I really think now that we've gone online, people take up more of our time for meetings than less, but I don't know. I may be misinterpreting that. I'm checking in someone who just came to class. Okay, so here we go. Watergate, I think we'd started talking about this. You'll want to know the basics of Watergate. So Nixon, running for re-election, 72. He's concerned about re-election. He thinks somebody's up to something. They might have a sneak attack. He doesn't know. So his people, committee to re-elect the president, so the overall committee and then this separate subcommittee, committee to re-elect the president, or CREEP, decided that they would break into the Democratic National Committee headquarters at the Watergate Hotel and Office Complex, hence the name of the scandal being Watergate, to steal the campaign plans. And so they do, and they get caught. They didn't have ID with them, but one of them had a little notebook, had some phone numbers. They called one of the phone numbers. The phone was answered at the White House, and then the police started investigating. This is the year of the election. It's mentioned in the news, but it's not like the biggest story. I mean, it's a story, but it's mixed in with ceasefire in Vietnam and end of protests and all sorts of other stuff. Plus you have, you know, it's a full election year the way it was this year. So you have everybody in Congress or everybody in the House running, a third of the Senate, you've got local. So kind of, you know, it's a story, but it's not the story. Also, the House, which would investigate things like this, is not exactly paying attention because they're running for re-election. So they'll take this up when they get back, the new House of Representatives. So when they start to investigate, what they find out is, oh, by the way, Nixon won by a lot. Nixon likely did not know about this before or during, but certainly found out after. Rather than announcing this or telling the police and asking them to investigate, instead he decides that he will work to cover this up. So people who are investigating get fired, or they get IRS audits, or they get followed by the FBI. Also, when people are subpoenaed who work for the president, what they find out is that Nixon has the habit of taping all of the conversations in his office and writing out transcripts of them. So the House committee subpoenas those transcripts and tapes. Nixon refuses. The House committee, the House appeals to the Supreme Court, which is one of the things the Supreme Court does besides hear cases of appeal. They also, if you have a concern against somebody, like one state has a concern against another, or somebody within the federal government has a concern against someone else, they also hear those disputes. So the House asked the Supreme Court to ask Nixon to turn over the transcripts and tapes. They order him to, and he does, sort of, except the parts that they really need to hear are erased and deleted. And if you're wondering, like, why did he refuse? He said for national security reasons, because, you know, sometimes things are said in the White House, in his office, that really are classified. And that's legitimate, but certainly what he was trying to cover up was not classified. So um, this leads to charges of destruction of evidence and some other stuff. So the House decides to issue articles of impeachment. And I think we've talked about this a little. The way impeachment works is the House decides yes or no, and then the Senate has the trial. And you may have seen an impeachment or two in your lifetime. You might have noticed the Trump impeachment, although that was probably not as covered. I mean, it was covered on the news, but it wasn't covered on the news. It was covered on news channels, that sort of thing, which you may or may not watch. The Clinton impeachment, that was covered on the news and made it really tough to teach high school. Just trust me on that. And then the Nixon impeachment, which I also remember, and you don't, was covered on the news. So, but the House has to bring charges, and then the Senate has to run the trial. In Nixon's case, the senators who were Republicans went to Nixon, or on the impeachment committee in the Senate, went to, or the trial committee in the Senate, went to Nixon and said, hey, looking at the evidence that we have right now, we're going to convict you, and the punishment will be we kick you out of office. So what we would suggest for you is that you resign. And he said, I will never resign. And then he resigns a couple days later because he's going to get kicked out of office. And, you know, who wants that? You've noticed in the modern era, the Senate is much less like, I know this is fairly modern, but the Senate is more conservative, and I don't mean Republican. I mean, they're less likely to take a strong action in some ways than the House. You might have noticed that. And if you watch some of the hearings recently, either Supreme Court hearings, or maybe you watch some of those hearings about the tech people and what news they label, or what tweets or posts or whatever they label and what posts they don't. The senators might be a little rude to some of the people testifying. They tend to be fairly polite to each other, and they tend to kind of not want to make too many big changes because they get reelected if everything's kind of the same, and the House gets reelected if everything's out of control. Reelect people for different reasons, it seems. So the Senate is much less likely to do as dramatic things as the House will do. But in this instance, the senators just told Nixon, man, you're out, so you might as well go on your own terms, and he did. Now, when Nixon goes on his own terms, he leaves behind a bunch of folks who end up going to jail. 4 or 5 of his staff go to jail for covering things up, for illegally investigating things, for illegally firing people. They fired a whole bunch of people on one day, and they call it the Saturday Night Massacre. So it sounds really bad, but it's kind of bad, but nobody dies. And several of his staffers go to jail. They're prosecuted over this, and there's talk of Nixon being prosecuted over this as well. Now, you may or may not remember, Nixon had to replace his elected vice president, Spiro Agnew, with an appointed one who was Gerald Ford. People tended to like Gerald Ford, which is why they picked him, so he'd be easily confirmed. Gerald Ford's first official action as president is to pardon Nixon so that he doesn't get prosecuted for whatever he did during Watergate. And that is going to be frustrating to some people who are going to think that maybe Ford had made a deal with Nixon to be vice president, so in exchange for being vice president, he would agree not to have him prosecuted. There's certainly no evidence of that. No evidence that Ford and Carter, or wrong guy, Ford and Nixon were, even friends at all. But people still thought that, and people were upset because other people had gone to jail because of Watergate, and Nixon did not. So this is probably going to be the first nail in Ford's election campaign coffin. However, there will be several more to come, mostly the economy. The economy is really bad in the Ford presidency. See, Watergate, oh, crud, why did I not write the date down? Watergate, I think, is 75. 75. Maybe it's not that late. It's probably, the election 72, so it would have to be, I'm looking it up. Okay. But 73, I know for sure, is when they started the impeachment process. But I don't remember if Nixon resigned in 73 or 74. 75 is too late. Sorry. Are you looking it up? I'm looking it up too on my phone. Do you guys use your phone for good or evil? 74. It's when he resigns. Okay. All right. I would always tell my high school students to use your phone for good, like looking up stuff during class, not for evil, like texting your friends or Kardashian updates or things like that. Okay, back to business. Did I scroll past it? No. All right, so Nixon resigns in 74, so Ford has the end of his presidency. He could technically run for 2 more. Let's see, 70, no, because 73, 74, nope, he could only run for 1 more. Because after the 25th Amendment, it is presidential succession. You can have either, if you take over somebody else's presidency, if it's more than half, you can only run for 1, and less than half, you can run for 2. And this was just over half because it was late 74, August of 74. Because I looked it up, because I forgot. All right, so Nixon resigns, Ford takes over. The economy is super stinky. It was bad during the Nixon administration, and gas prices were going up and down, and sometimes we had shortages and sometimes we didn't. But now we're going to have shortages pretty consistently, and inflation's going to go up. And it's inflation on stuff, prices go up on stuff that we typically buy, like food and gasoline. So, you know, if it went up on luxury yachts or private jets or something, nobody would care. So I know some people would care because people work on those and make those, and those industries affect people. But if it's food and gas, that affects every single person. So inflation is high, prices are high, unemployment's on the rise, and we can't get gas when we want it. So to the point where they will start rationing it or limiting, they limit the amount you can buy and what days you can buy it on. And you have to go and line up. It typically was by the last number of your license plate. And sometimes they would run out. People would try to skip in line, and then people would fight. Occasionally people would shoot each other. It was crazy times. It was a mess. I was not terribly involved because I was, 6 or 7 or 8 or however old I was at this point. Okay, but I do remember seeing it on the news. It was a little frightening, not gonna lie, as a little kid. The economy is bad. Ford tries to counter this with a program called Whip Inflation Now, which, and they also suggest that you turn your thermostat down and wear a sweater when it's cold, to save fuel. And most of the things they suggest are, really suggestions. They're not changes of anything. And so there's no policy change, there's no dramatic change. So the economy doesn't change. So people didn't trust Ford because the first thing he did was pardon Nixon, and the economy is terrible. And there'll be another Republican that challenges Ford, which hardly ever happens to a sitting president. It'd be like if somebody strongly ran against Trump this last year for the nomination, which nobody did. So the guy who runs against Ford is Ronald Reagan, and he's a pretty well-spoken dude, and we'll see him again. And this probably, I would guess, that he ran that year just to get his name out there and to get people to see him, knowing that, he wasn't going to be the guy, but maybe in 4 years he would be the guy, which he was. The guy that Ford runs against, who is probably going to win just because he's not Ford, is Jimmy Carter. And we like Jimmy Carter. If you look at that living room candidate site that I suggested a class or 2 ago, where the campaign commercials are, If you look at Carter campaign commercials, he's typically on his tractor, he's in blue jeans and a work shirt, and talks about how he's just like you, he's just a small town guy. Um, he's got a nice Southern accent, he teaches Sunday school, he's married, has a cute kid. So, you like him, he's your neighbor. Jimmy Carter's not really your neighbor. His family owns a multi-million-dollar peanut farm in Georgia. He had been the governor of Georgia, and he had a degree in nuclear physics from the Naval Academy. So he's really not your average guy in any way at all. But he is a very unassuming guy. He, has accomplished a lot of things, but doesn't remind you of them. Super nice guy. And we were kind of ready for that. And not that Ford wasn't a nice guy, we just didn't trust him because he's an extension of the Nixon presidency, which we didn't trust. And then we weren't super excited about LBJ because, Vietnam. So we hadn't had a president that just seemed like a down home, we can trust you kind of guy in quite a while. So Carter, it's a breath of fresh air for us. And he promised that he would never lie to the American people. And he likely did not lie to the American people. If you're wondering, heating pad, my shoulder. It's hard, man, I'm old. But Carter promises that he'll be honest with the American people. He's going to base his foreign policy on humanitarian issues. Now, the last time we had a president who did that is Woodrow Wilson. Humanitarian issue-based foreign policy is tough because you've got to decide if somebody's good and evil, and then if it's your traditional ally who's doing something wrong, do you really want to do something that they won't like? Or if it's a very large country like China that's doing something wrong and your economy is more dependent on them than you would like in this era, probably because we're selling stuff to them. In our era, probably because we're buying stuff from them. That makes it tricky. And Carter's going to overlook certain human rights issues and consider others. And that's, it's just going to be inconsistent by nature. So, but I am not suggesting that anybody else's foreign policy is terribly consistent, because even in those eras where we decide we're going to be very interventionist with our foreign policy, we clearly don't intervene in everything. Clear. You're going like, yeah, we clearly are inconsistent. Yes, of course we are. All right. So Carter, good stuff that happens during the Carter administration. Now, I don't know, we like Carter. So he's a nice guy. And the Camp David Accords, those are the things. We like him because he's a nice guy, and the Camp David Accords. Maybe the Panama Canal Treaty, although it wasn't certainly popular in that era, but it's more popular in retrospect because, it just seems like a no-brainer now. And then pretty much everything else is kind of a mess in the Carter administration. So Camp David Accords, legitimate peace treaty between Egypt and Israel, develops more secular-based relationship between those two countries, and will lead to Nobel Peace Prize for their leaders, Menachem Begin and Anwar Sadat, one of whom, Sadat, will end up being assassinated by forces within his country because they really didn't want to make peace with Israel. So, and that's a fairly consistent issue in that region of the world, that pretty much no one wants to make peace with Israel for a variety of reasons, historical and cultural, which is why anytime there's a peace agreement between Israel and anybody else that lives near them, it's kind of a big deal. So, and this was more than kind of a big deal. Those were the two major competing nations in the region. And if they become economic partners, then the trade routes will be open, the flow of oil will be easier, that kind of stuff. So it'll be better for everyone internationally, and certainly the region, and certainly those two countries. It's the idea. So works out really well, pretty well. Not for Anwar Sadat or Menachem, yeah, Anwar Sadat, but works out pretty well for other folks. Other stuff, let's see. Panama Canal Treaty. We had overthrown the Panamanian government some years. Well, we hadn't. Oh, yeah. Let me start again. We overthrew the Colombian government to help create Panama as an independent nation because we love freedom and we wanted to build a canal there. So we had controlled the canal since it was built. So our thought was now we will return the control or give control to the actual country of Panama at this point. That seems like a no-brainer now. During this era, that region was fairly unstable. I recognize it's still economically unstable and unstable in some other ways as well. But our concern in this era was that there were lots of communist forces, you know, communism, and we didn't want the communists to get control of the canal. So it wasn't as popular as you might imagine during the 70s, but when it gets closer to occurring, it's either the last day of 1999 or the first day of 2000. By then, the Cold War is over. That region is more stable militarily, at least in, you know, for purposes of trade. I do recognize that there's still going to be lots of coups and lots of different things go on there that aren't exactly stable. But as far as keeping the canal open, it doesn't seem like as big an issue by the time we do it. Oh, the other thing I was going to mention is Camp David Accords, while certainly negotiated by the Carter administration, probably made possible by the changes in foreign policy that you saw in the Nixon administration. And one of the things I think we rarely talk about, especially now, the way politics are, is how one presidential administration sometimes builds on the accomplishments of a previous one. And that's really kind of, I think, how it's supposed to work, because, you know, maybe one president does something that looks good and is in the best interest of the country. And when the next administration comes in, they're probably not as aware of it. And then they go like, oh, that was cool. And so they build on that. So Carter certainly did that with Nixon's foreign policy. In this instance, not consistently, but in that instance. And you'll see it. I think the most recent thing I heard about in the news was about virology, developing vaccines for viruses, which we're seeing in a fairly important way right now, development. But a lot of how that was regulated and changed and funded changed during George W. Bush's administration, because that's when we started seeing pandemics as perhaps the biggest global threat, because we're moving away from the idea of, you know, the Cold War and other countries being bigger global threats, but by, you know, disease being that. So they changed how everything was regulated and how vaccines were funded and developed and how the National Institute of Health participated. And each administration following that has built on that to the point where, you know, we end up with several different vaccines being developed within months of a disease, or maybe a year by the time we're done. But, you know, from development to perhaps being used more publicly. And that happened over 3 or 4 different presidencies. And then, of course, the Biden administration, I'm assuming, but I think most people are assuming that as well, that his administration will be, you know, the one that really capitalizes on distributing vaccines, that sort of thing, which is how this is all supposed to work, you know, building on what the previous person did. But also in the modern era, probably, you know, current president taking more credit than maybe not assessing as much credit to previous administrations. And I really don't mean just Trump. I mean, you know, in the modern era, politicians aren't as likely to see collaboration as a strong quality. That's really what I'm saying. Okay. All right. So, Carter. Panama Canal Treaty, okay, better in retrospect than at the time. But some problems with inconsistency in human rights policy. There'll be certain countries that he'll overlook human rights issues and other countries that he'll punish for human rights issues. And there's also a big hostage crisis in Iran during that time period. We had put the Shah of Iran, a guy named Rajiv Pahlavi, in charge in the 50s because he would be more friendly to US policy, and he was essentially a dictator. And if people disagreed with him, he imprisoned them. So he was certainly not a fair ruler at all and not reelected. So, but we were okay with that because, you know, he cooperated with us. And that's very typical of our foreign policy in the 50s and 60s, and maybe even a little in the 70s. However, early 70s. However, the Iranian people were getting a little tired of him, and they were about to overthrow him, which meant that he was going to be killed. He also was old and had cancer and wanted to leave the country, and people were blocking that, and he asked for US help to get out of the country so he could come to the US for cancer treatment, which we agreed to. And then once he got to the United States, the new Iranian government asked us to send him back, the Ayatollah Khomeini, and they said, send him back so that we can put him on trial. And we said, no, that would not be in a humanitarian interest. And so they took over the US embassy and took about 100 hostages. The US attempted a hostage rescue, which completely failed. The helicopters that were taking the soldiers who were going to run the hostage rescue crashed into each other because of, I think, a sandstorm in the desert when they were taking off. And there were pictures taken of that, and Iran celebrated their success in defeating our attempts. And it really made the Carter administration look weak on foreign policy. We also were trying to negotiate a strategic arms limitations treaty round 2 with the Soviets, and those talks kind of blew up. Not literally, sorry, wrong choice of words, but they were not effective. And maybe in part, our national security advisor wasn't very collaborative. He didn't like the Soviet Union and didn't really want to have, my impression, and not just my impression, stuff that I've read, was probably not the right guy to lead these talks. But anyway, we end up with a peace treaty kind of falling apart with the Soviet Union, which might have limited more types of nuclear weapons. In response to that, the relationship between the United States and the Soviet Union gets worse pretty quickly, kind of a little sharp decline, even though we'd been on the uptick for a while. The Soviet Union also invades Afghanistan. We're going to protest that by not going to the Olympics, which are going to be held in Moscow that year, and also sending weapons to the Afghanis, which might, be bad later. And people in the United States were very frustrated because we didn't go to the Olympics. I know that sounds silly, but we love the Olympics. It's a great chance for us to show how superior we were to evil, godless communists in the Soviet Union and China. Yeah, we need to beat China as well. And for my generation, going to the Olympics and winning things was really a kind of a point of national pride, I suppose. Maybe more so than it is now. I don't know if that kind of stuff appeals to younger folks, but we saw it as a part of the Cold War. We really did. So not going to the Olympics was kind of a cultural issue, I suppose. But, the big problem is the economy, as bad as it was during the Ford administration, and it was bad. It was worse during the Carter administration. Access to oil was getting worse. There were shortages, and inflation was worse, unemployment was worse, interest rates were worse, and they would combine those three things and called it the misery index. So, if you're running for office and they're talking about the misery index under your presidency, it's probably not a good sign. The year of the election, Jimmy Carter also gives a speech and essentially says if people weren't so selfish and self-involved and got more involved in their communities, things would be better. That may not be the right speech to give to people you want to vote for you. Carter's not going to win re-election, no matter how much we liked him as a person, which we did. And, you know, he had come in saying he was going to be honest and straightforward, and he mostly was. And of course, as an ex-president, he's just the nicest guy ever and does Habitat for Humanity and all sorts of charitable stuff and lives a fairly quiet life. And, you know, at times will go and help with negotiating peace deals and hostage deals. He's a good guy, but his presidency did not end well. So with the hostage crisis, with the failed rescue attempt, with the Soviets invading Afghanistan, with the boycott of the Olympics, and the terrible, terrible economy, he's not going to win re-election. The guy that runs against him will be Ronald Reagan, and he's the focus of your weekly question, and we'll get to him in just a minute. Okay, you guys have any questions thus far? I'm going to stop and look and see the chat. Is there anything you guys want to ask? Do you have any questions? You know, this is why I wonder sometimes if you guys are paying attention. Not trying to be rude. This and the fact that, like, misery index. Okay, thanks for asking that. And thanks for saying you got it. So misery index was combined statistics of the interest rates, the unemployment rates, and inflation. So they would add those together. And they were really high in the Carter administration. That really was, we had a pretty good recession back then. I would say, we had a pretty bad one kind of end of Bush, beginning of Obama, which you may or may not remember depending on your age. And then of course we've had a messy year this year as well. So with economics, but we all understand the cause of that, at least that's more obvious, I think. But oh, we don't still have a misery index. Yeah, we don't talk about that anymore. Although they have different measures of if the economy's in recession, that sort of stuff. It tends to be 2 quarters of negative economic growth, which, you know, is unusual, turns into a recession. And then a depression is 4 quarters of negative economic growth where the economy is getting smaller. And it would probably feels like we should be in one of those right now, but the third quarter, the one we just ended, there was the biggest increase in US history, which it probably doesn't feel like, but that's why the stock market is pretty good right now. That and the fact that we didn't elect all one party to everything, that makes the stock market nervous. So we'll probably have Biden as president. I say probably just in case a couple of you are, you know, fans of the lawsuits that Trump is filing. I really don't think they'll be successful, but I've surely been wrong about stuff before. But the House will be definitely controlled by Democrats, even though there are a couple of races still outstanding, but not very many, not enough to change it, but a few more Republicans won. So there's more Republicans in the House, but still controlled by the Democrats. And the Senate will be really close. There's those 2 races left in Georgia. But I don't know, people who invest tend to like it when there's inertia in the government, which is what they think will happen because the 2 parties control different things. So, all right, back to the notes. Thanks for asking questions and telling me you're paying attention. I always appreciate that. I know there are times I really wish I just told you all you had to put your faces on there, but there are reasons that I don't do that. There are a lot of reasons. So if it were up to me, I probably wouldn't put my face on there and you wouldn't get to see my cereal boxes every week. But I can have a background, couldn't I? I do have one. I should put my background up. Let me see if I can find it. Before we go, I'll look. Okay. Stuff that's going on that is related to politics during this era and court cases. So definitely these things, the Roe versus Wade, absolutely on the quiz, because it's one of the most important court cases. Sorry for putting my hands right in front of the camera. I don't know why I'm so sore today. I'm an old person. Moral majority, and then we'll talk about the court cases. The moral majority, these are religious folks who get much more directly involved in politics. Now, off and on, we'd had religious folks directly involved in politics. This was kind of an off period for direct involvement, but certainly, you know, you had seen people involved in civil rights movements who were religious, in cultural stuff, in let's help people get food and let's help with education, that sort of thing. But direct involvement like campaigning, endorsing candidates, contributing money, paying for commercials, that's going to be a new and kind of modern thing. And the moral majority will kind of be at the forefront of that in this era. So it's a coalition of conservative Christians and evangelicals, Catholics, Mormons, and Jews who will get together on things that they agree on. They tended to be very pro-life and pro-USA, so nationalistic, USA first kind of folks. So it's also where you see kind of a resurgence of that type of religious belief that may be closely combined with pride in your country with nationalism. So, you know, the churches where you've got the US flag on the stage, that sort of thing. So, or maybe do all churches do that? I don't know. Should take a survey, not of you, of course. I don't want to cause trouble, but I do wonder about that. But that was super common during this time period. And, you know, the idea that God had ordained the United States for to be special, the idea of exceptionalism, American exceptionalism, you'll see a resurgence of that during this time period. And part of what's going on in the Obama era is some pushback to that. And then part of what's going on with Trump is some pushback to that. It's not all of it, but it's part of it. This group in particular really likes Ronald Reagan and will campaign for him. Court cases that matter quite a bit. Oh, and if you're ever in, would you be interested in knowing more about that? The big leader of that is a guy named Jerry Falwell. And that's only moderately relevant because his son, what's his name, Falwell, was a big Trump supporter and the head of a college called Liberty University. And he just maybe got in huge trouble for not being quite as conservative and Christian as he should have been in his personal life. So, you know, kind of made that movement look a little bad. So, and interesting too, because his father, who probably was a little more on the up and up, probably, I'm not in charge of that, but certainly was not caught in any sort of scandals, really established this movement, and his son was trying to carry it on and then was apparently carrying on with some other things. So, okay. Maybe not interesting to you, but you know, to me, it's like, oh yeah, I know that Falwell guy. Yeah. All right. Court cases that mattered. Oh my goodness. If you've studied U.S. history and you don't leave the class knowing anything about Roe versus Wade, then I have not done my job. No, I'm not saying that that's the only important thing, but crud, that's a big one. Just right up there with Brown versus Board of Education and Plessy versus Ferguson as far as 20th century cases. And then, you know, maybe a couple other depending on your opinion, but Roe versus Wade's going to make the top 10 of anybody's list of court cases. It makes access to abortion a national issue. And I don't know that it's important just because of the issue. Although I recognize the issue is important, I think it's as important because of the controversy that the issue creates and the division that it creates, because this is one of those issues where there's really very little middle ground. And I know there is some middle ground, but typically people are, no, you should have absolute access to abortion, or it should either never or rarely happen. And there are very few people in the middle, like, you know, it's bad, but we have to allow it from time to time, because the people who oppose it see it as murder. And so if you see it as murder, then Well, a lot of the people, I'm not saying all, but if you see it as murder, you don't compromise on murder very often. So just the fact that they view it that way, that people view it that way, makes it harder to compromise about. But the way that abortion worked before 73, before Roe versus Wade, is it was a state decision. So, you know, in the middle of the country in the South, it wasn't allowed. And then on the coasts and, you know, maybe a few states in the North, it was allowed. So if you lived in Texas and wanted an abortion, you'd have to go somewhere else. Typically, people went to Mexico, apparently, and Norma McCorvey, Roe in this case, wanted an abortion and went to a lawyer that she had heard had one, Sarah Weddington, whose practice was in Austin. And I think McCorvey was from the Dallas area, but I can't remember for sure. And this may be the class where somebody said that they knew her, or her one of her children, but I think she was from the Dallas area. She came here, talked to that lawyer to find out where to go. The lawyer said, hey, we can make a case, and they did. And the Supreme Court said, in the first 3 months, no state has the right to limit or prohibit abortion. Now, there'll be some limits that are placed on it later. Not much later, 76, the Hyde Amendment, makes it to where you cannot use federal funds, except in the case of rape or incest, to pay for abortion. And then states will add different restrictions that have to do with the age of the person requesting it, or maybe adding a fetal sonogram, that sort of thing. So, or, you know, certain things you have to read and agree to before. And in 73, you know, first trimester, I don't know how viable a baby or fetus, depending on your opinion, would have been after the first 3 months. Certainly survival rates for prematurely born babies are much greater now, so people would probably see viability in a different way. But this becomes a really controversial social, cultural issue, religious issue, all that sort of stuff. Okay. And the other case from this era that's pretty big is University of California Regents versus Bakke. Alan Bakke was a medical student, and he wanted to go to medical school at the University of California system. I think it was Santa Barbara, but I honestly don't remember. He had applied. His MCAT scores were pretty good. They were kind of, you know, right on the border of getting in, not getting in. He didn't get in, and looked at the statistics and found out that other people got in with much lower scores, but it was because they took racial and ethnic backgrounds as a major part of your application, and the Supreme Court ruled that that was unfair. And they used a quota system to do that as well. So they said, you know, a certain number of applicants had to be accepted who were of this background or that background. And he argued that was discriminatory, and the Supreme Court agreed with him. So the end result of this is to get rid of quota systems. So it isn't that you can't consider race or ethnicity at all, but it can't be, you can't have a strict quota system, like for every 100 people we let in, 20 have to be this, 10 have to be that, 12 have to be this. So that's seen as unconstitutional. And there have been many cases regarding using and considering race and ethnicity for college admission since then. And the general, very vague rule is it can be a part of the consideration, but it can't be a major part of the consideration. So, which is why different states do different formulas, like top 10 or 8 or whatever percent. So, all right. Also in the 70s, we had a near nuclear core accident. We had a core reactor meltdown at a nuclear power plant in 3 Mile Island, which I believe is Pennsylvania, so a highly populated area. And while this didn't harm anyone, there were nothing dangerous was emitted. The core reactor meltdown was meant that that was the next thing that was going to happen, that if it couldn't cool properly, that nuclear waste would be emitted into the atmosphere, and that would be, you know, our version of Chernobyl, which we didn't have, but it scared the crap out of people. So the end result of this is much less investment and use of nuclear power in the United States. And there are other countries that this is their main source. You see it a lot in Japan, although, you know, there's certainly issues with that, with earthquakes and tsunamis, problematic. And then in France, you don't see as many issues with that because they're, you know, in a different place as far as geography. So, all right. So those are just kind of incidental things going on in the 70s, and then back to politics. So Reagan runs for president in 1980, because Carter wins in 76, bicentennial year, he runs against Ford. And then 1980, Reagan runs against Carter and says a couple of things that work really well. The big thing here, one of the questions he asks is, are you better off now than you were 4 years ago? And since most people will clearly answer no, this is very helpful to him. And because his presidency round one goes really well, he'll use the exact same question in round two because things were so much better. Also, he is going to suggest that the best years of the United States are in our future, not our past. And we were definitely not feeling that at the time period. So that restored sense of optimism was nice. And the campaign commercials, which you can see on Living Room Candidate, which start off with "It's Morning in America," and they've got all these sweet pictures of, you know, people with their grandparents and celebrating birthdays and getting married and buying a house. So it restores this idea that there's hope for our country. He also promises that the government will get out of your life, so less government. And I remember one of the things that he said pretty consistently was the most frightening words in the English language are, I'm from the government and I'm here to help. So his contention was that the government tends to make things worse rather than better, and that people are better equipped to solve their own problems. So we should give power back to the people and potentially the states. So, and you saw some of that in the Nixon administration, but not to the extent that you'll see it in the Reagan administration. All right. So Reagan wins by quite a bit and then becomes president. And the very first thing that happens on the day of inauguration is the Iranians let the hostages go. And so, you know, it's either kind of a final insult to Carter, which is, you know, partly what it was, and maybe a sign that they were a little more nervous about Reagan and his foreign policy. That's certainly how Reagan was going to assume, you know, like, oh, they're scared of me. And, you know, both could be true. So the hostages get out on day one. So it increases our optimisms, like, yeah, now we're the America that we used to be. We're tough, we're respected. And we'll have a few military actions that will kind of back that up, primarily Falkland Islands, but there'll be some issues also in Lebanon that make things, you know, a little iffier. So the military actions that we participate in will be, you know, kind of hit and miss. But some of the things that we do as far as increasing military spending, most people in the country will think of as positive during this era. I think, you know, maybe looking back, there might be people that will say like, yeah, we probably spent too much then. But most people would argue that it was that kind of final nail in the coffin of the Soviet Union. So it brings an end to the Cold War, which, you know, may or may not be good. I think everybody thinks that the end of the Cold War is probably good, but, you know, what we do, what we replace it with, whole different story, I suppose. One of the first major things that happens during the Reagan administration, he's going to deregulate, or his administration will deregulate a lot of things, especially energy-related things, but also mental health-related things, which people will argue might have led to the increase in homelessness that we'll see during the Reagan administration, because you know the economy will improve during the Reagan administration by most measures, but homelessness will increase by quite a bit. And one of the major changes, it's odd, I was talking about this with somebody over the weekend, but it's sort of, you know, it must be fun to talk to me in my personal life, right? Because it always seems to turn into a history lecture. Like, how are you? I'm fine. Let's talk about Reagan's policies regarding mental health. Somebody's loud. I'll try to mute them. Okay. All right. But yeah, my husband always told me, he's like, just don't even talk to her. You know, he would get upset with me. But anyway, mental health regulations changed. They were deregulated quite a bit during this time period. And before this time period, if people thought that you might be a danger to yourself or others or the community in general, your family or community authorities could commit you pretty easily. And that is just not the case anymore. So we had, you know, state hospitals that were fuller of people with mental health issues. When that gets deregulated, those folks have the choice of staying or going. And a lot of them left, you know, because you get your own choice, and probably most people would not want to stay in a place where you didn't have a lot of freedom. But untreated, lots of folks with those issues have trouble holding a job, and maybe they're not close to their families. So a lot of times you see people who are homeless, statistically, I'm not saying it's a majority, but you do see a big increase in homelessness right after mental health institutions are deregulated and there's less state power to put people in those institutions. And I am crud. I have no idea if that's good or bad or what. It's probably both. But you know, the good or bad part you guys get to decide. The statistical part we can look at and say, like, no, clearly that increased. And when that increases, when the economy is improving, it's either a sign that the economy is improving unevenly, which was also true, or that that affected homelessness, and probably both of those things are true. TYPO strike, those are air traffic controllers, Professional Air Traffic Controller Organization, I think is what the O stands for. They had decided, and I think still, air traffic controllers have like the highest rated anxiety of anybody in any job. That, I don't know if that's still true. I haven't looked at statistics lately, but I know teacher used to be up there. It's probably still up there right now. I'm not talking about me and you. I'm talking about, you know, public school, elementary, that kind of thing. But air traffic controllers, they're the ones who tell you when you're going to land the plane, when the plane's going to take off, who's in what order. And crud, if you make a mistake, that's a huge problem. That's an enormous problem. So you got to be good at this, and you can't make a mistake, and that's a lot of pressure. So these guys said, look, there's not enough of us. We don't get paid enough. We got to train more people. We need fewer hours. So they had a problem. And air traffic's increasing during that era. So they said, we've got to fix this. And if you don't agree to this, we're all going to go on strike. And President Reagan said, you know what, you guys are federal employees, you're public safety employees. It's not legal for you to go on strike. So if you decide you're going on strike, I will fire every last one of you and make sure you can never be rehired. And they thought he was bluffing, because who in their right mind would fire every air traffic controller in the United States that went on strike, because you can't really replace them quickly. So they just said, okay, let's see how it goes. And they went on strike. And guess what Ronald Reagan did? He fired every last one of them and mandated, I think it was an executive order, that they could not be rehired. It was unusual. Let's go with that. And if you're wondering, how do you replace air traffic controllers? You take military dudes. So people who were in the National Guard and the reserves, and some active duty folks as well, who did this in the military, they put them in public airports and also had them train new employees. And there was a huge shortage, and the guys with on-the-job training doing this stuff. And this was a very exciting time to fly commercially. Now, there were not, if you look at statistics from this time period, there really weren't more accidents or mistakes, but there were lots of near misses and stories on the news almost every day of airplanes maybe running off the runway or somebody allowing two planes to land at once. Now, they tended to notice if there was another plane trying to land at the same time they were. However, oh my goodness, very exciting time to fly. That executive order is rescinded in the Clinton administration. So I'm sure those guys went on to other careers. Very exciting. But and they deregulated energy industries, lots of industries. I think trucking got deregulated quite a bit, transportation. So what you saw was Reagan following through on the deregulation of certain things, but also, when these guys went on strike, he brought in some federal power and said, we're firing all of you. So Reagan's a little bit of a mixed bag, but we did see that if he made a promise, like if you all do this, even if it doesn't seem like I'll do it, I will fire all of you, he does. He seems to be a man of his word, and people notice that. He's also going to develop something called his administration, the Strategic Defense Initiative, SDI, which is nicknamed by people who weren't as fond of it, Star Wars. And this is supposed to be missile shield technology to be able to shoot down nuclear weapons that maybe the Soviet Union shot at us. And it was called Star Wars and Nuclear Shield because I guess from movies of that time period, I guess there's a part where somebody's shooting stuff at you, so you press a button and it brings the shield down. Now, of course, that's not the kind of technology they developed, although that would be pretty cool. If we could press a button, we'd have a little bubble over our country to stop weapons, which I know aren't being shot at us, by the way. But still, it'd be cool, like in the movies. What they did instead was develop things that could detect and shoot down things that might be headed our way. And part of this is developed, part of it is not. Certainly we spend a lot of money on research and development of this. And if you're wondering, do we ever really use any of this? Yeah, we do, oddly enough. I can remember a few years ago, it's probably 4 or 5 at this point, we had a military communications satellite. You can think of that as a spy satellite if you like. That was about to fall out of orbit, so we wanted to shoot it down. So we had it on an open channel so that, yeah, and definitely overseas, you're not kidding about that. I know that, in the Middle East and, countries that are close to each other that really don't like each other, they absolutely use that technology, absolutely. So we're not so worried about, Canada and Mexico and us shooting at each other. So yeah, it's not as much of an issue here. Yeah, no kidding. In Iran, yeah. Israel definitely has a system that works. Yeah, and certainly Iran. Yeah, no, that's exactly where it's used. When we use it, like I was saying, we shot down a communication satellite, and we had an open channel. I think it was on the internet, certainly not on TV, where people could watch this. And I think it was a particle beam weapon or particle beam that they shot down this satellite, which was tens of thousands of miles away. And they had to hit it right in the battery pack, which was maybe like this big. And they hit it first time. And the reason that we remind people we can do that, that's just for our friends in China primarily, maybe a little bit Iran, who's a little pesky, and maybe a little bit Russia, but it's really China. It's like, hey, you have more money and you're developing things faster, but we still have better stuff than you. So look at this. All right. But this increasing the military during this time period, especially when we'd had that failed hostage raid, and increasing military technology, spending more on the military kind of restores some feeling of national pride especially with people who supported Reagan, and they like that. We're also going to simultaneously threaten and negotiate with the Soviet Union, which to me was bizarre because, I'm again, of age during this time period where I'm paying attention. So I'm, a teen and young adult in the Reagan administration, I suppose. Yeah, I'm a young adult, I guess. And So while he's calling the Soviet Union the evil empire, he's also negotiating with them at the same time, and negotiating successfully, which is really odd. And the most successful negotiations in Reykjavik in Iceland, between Reagan and Gorbachev, the negotiations aren't going that well, and they both decide to get rid of all of their assistants except for the translators, and just the two of them begin to talk because their policy experts were arguing with each other. And what they end up negotiating is a really serious disarmament treaty that goes way beyond what SALT I had done and would eventually lead to almost complete nuclear disarmament. So now this is ushered in by an era of perestroika and glasnost, which is openness and Westernness and the idea of free press and changes in the Soviet Union. Part of the reason there are changes in the Soviet Union is there's also less money in the Soviet Union, and the Communist Party is having less and less control, and they're realizing that. There are certain countries where there are solidarity unions, most notably Poland at first, are pushing back and getting rid of Soviet control. So you're starting to see a crack in the Soviet Union, and the Soviet Union itself will dissolve, I guess is the right word, break apart in 1991. With the Berlin Wall falling in '89, which is kind of the symbolic beginning of that end, and then '91, the official end. So the historians from this time period, I think, have a personal opinion here, which I definitely won't quiz you over, have a hard time giving Reagan much credit for any of this stuff because they dislike Reagan so much, because they typically were, in college or in the early part of their profession during this time period. And Reagan was certainly doing things with Department of Education and other things that they, and military stuff. And there were things that lots of people who were more left of center, which is true of most major historians, really disliked. So, I have friends a little bit older than me. People my age don't, I'm young enough that strong, angry feelings about politicians during this time period don't happen for most of us. We just look at it and go like, yeah, I remember that. And I remember this seeming good and that seeming bad, where we may have those stronger emotional attachments to people in the 1990s or the early 2000s. And you might have stronger emotional attachments to current politicians, or maybe none at all, who knows. But people who really disliked Reagan really disliked him. And a lot of people who were historians were starting their writing careers during this time period, and they did not like Reagan. So a lot of times when they write about the disarmament treaties and the end of the Soviet Union, I've read a lot of stuff where they say that Gorbachev is really the architect of that, and he should be given a lot of credit for that. And it's like, yeah, I think Gorbachev was just riding the sinking ship, but I'm going to look at it differently than they are, and they're certainly more knowledgeable about certain things. But anyway, all right, back to business. So Reagan's popularity. There's more stuff. Reagan's popularity, increase in the military and increasing pride in the military. You start to see the beginning of the end of the Cold War, and people who liked Reagan will probably credit him with that. I think he recognizes the situation and takes full advantage of it in an astute way. I'm not saying whether it's good or bad, but it's like, hey, I see this is going on. We might as well get on top of this. The economy improves. People feel better about the country. We host the Olympics, which had very little to do with Reagan, of course, but that's also a moment of national pride. But it's mostly that the economy improves, the military is stronger, and we just kind of ignore the national debt because we're getting other things along with it, and we think, you know what, we'll take care of that later. And this will be that first national debt that we create that we never actually pay off. I know what some of you are saying. I thought we paid that off during the Clinton administration. Are some of you saying that? There's 1 year that we spend less than we take in during the Clinton administration. So we're able to pay down some of the debt, but we've never eliminated the debt since, I don't know, Reagan or maybe a little before. Yeah. So not eliminating debt is kind of a modern thing. Through most of our history, we build it up, pay it off, probably the same way that you do in your personal life where, yeah, I don't need to talk to you about your personal life and your economics, but, in the modern era, we just build the debt. Okay, more stuff about Reagan. Sorry. Sorry. 1984, running for re-election against Walter Mondale, who I think is from Minnesota. I'm pretty sure he is. And Geraldine Ferraro, the first female VP candidate. She'll also be the chair of Hillary Clinton's campaign. She's from New York. And did I tell you Walter Mondale was Carter's vice president? But they don't win. Reagan wins by, he's popular, so, and the economy's better. And the truth is, usually if the economy's improving, unless there's a pandemic or something, you win re-election. So Reagan wins re-election. Scandalous thing for Reagan, probably the biggest scandal. There's a bunch of things that might be considered scandalous. And there are always going to be people who will argue that he didn't spend enough time and money to counter the AIDS crisis that we had during that time period. Now, the biggest expenditure of money that we spent on disease and research and development during that time period was about AIDS. It's just, you could argue, and you could be successful about it, that our structure for fighting disease, pandemics, that kind of stuff, was not in place to do it in a terribly effective way, which will be something that will change over time, thankfully. But, there will be some people who will argue that he didn't do enough to fight the AIDS crisis. I don't know if that's technically a scandal or not. But the scandal, like you got caught doing something, was the Iran-Contra affair. And we had spent a lot of time in the 50s, 60s, and early 70s using our military and our intelligence industry, CIA, to maybe intervene or interfere in other people's governments, to overthrow elected leaders, or to interfere in elections, that kind of stuff. It was just, countries do this to each other. They still do, as we know. And even at times assassinate other people's leaders. So we're going to pass something called the Boland Amendment. Excuse me. Oh, sorry. To make it illegal to use federal funds, we couldn't use state funds either, but to use government funds to assist countries in their own defense because they're going to be overthrown by a government we don't like, or, to intervene in any way, sort of without going through Congress and asking for official permission. And the Boland Amendment, made big changes on purpose in our foreign policy. So the Reagan administration really wanted to help overthrow the Sandinistas in Nicaragua. So we wanted to support the Contras, the counter-revolutionaries, anti-communist forces in Nicaragua. Couldn't really put that as a budget item, so what they did was sell weapons to Iran, which seems like an odd thing to do because we just had that crisis with them. But they were fighting with Iraq, who we didn't like, and we had armed Iraq when we didn't like Iran. So, oh, goodness. But we were selling weapons to Iran and using the proceeds of those weapons to fund the Contras, the counter-revolutionaries in Nicaragua. This was about to be discovered, and the person in charge of the operation, Colonel Oliver North, I believe he is a Marine colonel, and his assistant, Fawn Hall, because I remember watching the hearings on television, they got caught while they were shredding all the evidence. So, and they were successful at shredding most of the evidence. Now, He's going to get in trouble for destruction of evidence and of official government papers, and he will get discharged. I don't believe it was a dishonorable discharge, but his end result, he doesn't get in a whole lot of trouble. He does have to retire before he'd like to, I'm sure. But then he ends up with a news show on Fox News. I do remember that because my dad used to watch it. It was War Stories with Colonel Oliver North. So I don't know that he still has the news show because he would be really old. He'd have to be in his 80s because my dad's about 80 and I think he was older than my dad. But I don't know about that. But anyway, but this, when this happens, I remember, I gotta look at the time, don't I? I don't want to keep, oh crud, it's time to go. Why didn't you tell me? All right, but Reagan doesn't really get in a whole lot of trouble. You're supposed to tell me when I go too long. Crud, sorry. Generally, that doesn't stick to Reagan. They call him like the Teflon man because it's a non-stick coating for pans back in the day. Okay, General Reagan conclusions. The economy's better, so we like Reagan. We feel better about ourselves, so we like Reagan. The South likes Reagan, so South starts to vote for Republicans. Reagan coalition more diverse. Blue collar workers, people who typically voted for Democrats, start voting for Republicans. And there you go. So the South turns reliably Republican. Working class people start to switch over to the Republican Party, and I think that switch is probably really complete now in the Trump era, which is a strange transition. That's a reversal of stuff all the way back to Harry Truman. And more people who are not white, people who are Jewish, and some women, a lot of women will vote for Reagan. Women typically vote for Democrats by about 2/3. So, all right, I am so sorry for keeping you so long. I think I got the role pretty well. We don't have class next week, but if you want to have a Zoom meeting like to talk about stuff, let me know, send me an email. I'll send an announcement. If you have to go, please do. If you're concerned that I didn't get you on the roll, please let me know. Oh, crap.